challenge that will define Europe in the 21st century. It's the global energy crisis. The actions we take today and tomorrow will change the course of European history forever. Let's look ahead just 40 years. By 2050, we know that electricity will be the dominant source of energy in Europe, powering almost all surface transport. We know that an average growth rate of 2% will have doubled Europe's demand for electricity. A rate of 3% will have tripled it. And we know that during the same time frame, we need to slash our greenhouse gas emissions by 80%. Today, fossil fuels account for around 50% of EU energy consumption. But we know that by 2050, these finite resources will be running out.
The peak of discovery of oil was in the 60s. That's 40 years ago. And it's obvious that the peak of discovery has to deliver a corresponding peak of production. Now, there's a great argument raging as to whether it's this year, last year, a few years into the future, which really misses the point when what matters is the vision of the long decline on the other side of peak. And by the end of this century, the stuff's just about gone.
Diminishing resources are just part of the picture. As long as Europe is dependent on fossil fuels, energy security will pose a constant threat to supply.
It's a permanent security of supply threat from Russia via Ukraine to the European Union.
As competition for dwindling resources heats up, European countries operating individually cannot hope to compete with the US and emerging energy superpowers like China and India. The sheer scale of their purchasing power will give these giants priority supply and the ability to negotiate lower prices for their consumers, while one by one, EU member states and their consumers will move to the back of the queue. Europe as we know it will not survive the energy crisis unless we can find a new primary energy resource. It must have enormous capacity, it must be renewable, and we must own it indefinitely. The good news is we already have this resource, and it's on our doorstep. It is our offshore wind. So, how will it change Europe's energy future?
Well, first of all, we reduce our CO2 emissions. Second of all, we reduce our exposure to fossil fuel prices in the future and carbon prices in the future. It means that we don't have to import an ever-increasing amount of energy into Europe. It's our energy and we own it, and we can also reap the commercial benefits of exporting this to a world that a few decades from now cannot afford to live without it. One of the biggest advantages of wind energy is we know exactly what the cost of the fuel is going to be the next 25 years that they're going to operate. We know exactly what the carbon costs are going to be of that technology for the next 25 years. We have no idea what the cost is going to be on fossil fuels 25 years from now.
By 2050, we'll probably be making 50% of our electricity from wind power in Europe, 30% from solar. I reckon about 10% from new marine renewables, which haven't really been commercialised yet, and there'll probably be a role for for nuclear as well. There maybe 10%. If electricity demand doubles by 2050, we're going to have to construct 1.2 million megawatts of wind energy. If it trebles, we're going to have to construct 1.8 million megawatts. Given that we're only going to be able to build 200,000 megawatts approximately onshore, that means we're going to have to anticipate and to build 1 to 1.6 million megawatts of wind power in the seas and oceans around Northern Europe.
Europe has one of the world's best offshore wind resources. The question is, does that resource have the capacity to generate these vast quantities of electricity?
If you're looking at rather, close to shore within Europe, no further than 30 kilometres, and in relatively shallow waters, no deeper than 40 metres, you actually have more than enough to supply Europe's current needs. And we're not looking at the wider North Sea, which actually is a quite shallow sea. There's quite a bit of it, no deeper than 30 metres. So there's even more available there if you go further offshore.
Offshore wind has the capacity to meet our future electricity needs many times over, but we shouldn't underestimate the task Europe has to undertake to harness it.
Never in history before had we to take electricity on average over, let's say, 1,000 miles and carry it to where the people are. It's the greatest project that Europe will ever engage in. It'll be the main source of our energy by 2050. We don't have any options but to do it. Wind energy and other forms of marine energies and solar energy has to be taken where those energies exist. So in the north, we're going to be taking most of our electricity from wind, and in the south we're going to be taking most of our electricity from the sun, and they're going to be linked up through a pan-European supergrid. An electricity grid designed to carry electricity from remote areas out at sea to where the people will consume the electricity in various concentrations in cities, towns, on land. So it's a collection of cables and switching stations and routers and various arrangements for carrying that electricity as cheaply as possible to where the people will consume it. It's different, it's innovative, it's new, it hasn't been, this kind of grid has not been built before.
The plan is to build supernode close to clusters of 500 megawatt wind farms. Our supernode design uses the advantages of both AC and high voltage DC to collect the renewable power and deliver it to the consumer. Power will be transported from a wind farm to the nearest supernode using high voltage AC. AC gives us maximum flexibility and efficiency over relatively short distances. Each supernode will have at least 2 and typically 4 AC to DC converter stations. The supernode will convert the power to HVDC, which gives us minimum losses over long distances. It will then be routed to its destination, which is a load centre on land, and then converted back to AC for distribution on the existing AC grids to the consumer.
The Supergrid is the platform on which we can build Europe's energy future, an EU-wide network that will harness our offshore wind and allow us to share and trade all forms of electricity across our borders, connecting individual countries to a vast and sustainable energy resource, uniting our fragmented energy market and changing the way Europe makes, transmits and consumes electricity for generations to come. Time is not on our side. Europe needs to act fast. We have just 40 years to turn the Supergrid from a blueprint into a reality.
Nobody should be under any misapprehensions. We have to do this. We can't rely on anybody else to give us our energy by 2050.
The Supergrid will be built on a new spirit of pan-European cooperation, the commitment of the EU and the EIB, and the vision of the energy sector. Working together, they can ensure that Europe's Supergrid is fully operational by 2050. By 2015, we need an EU business plan to finance our ports and vessels, and we need a new offshore transmission system operator. By 2020, our ports and vessels must be in place. Between 2020 and 2050, we need to construct the Supergrid network and build 40,000 megawatts of offshore wind each year, so that by 2050, you and I and consumers all over Europe will be plugged into the Supergrid network.
The greatest challenge facing Europe is to be able to supply ourselves with basic energy, and to accomplish that in a way which reduces carbon dioxide emissions by 80% from their 1990 levels. The world and Europe is on a once-off transition to sustainability. And that's a big challenge. It's never had to be done before. We've built this world of ours on fossil fuels. And now we have to unbuild it and do it in a race to the future by 2050.
We must not minimise the undertaking that lies ahead, but the prizes far outweigh the challenges. Zero emissions from power generation. Access to an infinite resource. Freedom from fuel price volatility. Security of supply. A powerful single electricity market. And the greatest prize of all, an energy independent Europe by 2050.